Welcome to episode 2 of Fact 5'em. This episode will be a bit shorter than the previous one, and was originally going to have less old-school racism. While doing some research for this one, I happened to notice a theme in the article that I will be discussing, which matched up almost perfectly with a book I happen to be reading. I will get more into the contents, title, and nature of that book later on. I'm planning on dividing this video up into 2 parts. Part 1, the part you're currently watching, will not have any of the old school racism, but Part 2 most certainly will. You will not have to worry about any of that old school racism popping up in this episode, and you can watch away without having to fear. As for the old school racism that will be included in Part 2, I will go into more detail regarding that in the opening of Part 2. Without further ado, enjoy Facts 5'em Episode 2, Part 1. Guaranteed to have at least 1/5 of your recommended daily dose of facts. Welcome to Facts 5'em Episode 2, Part 1, Producerism. Producerism is one of those words that is honestly a bit obtuse. One that I've seen pop up on occasions, usually in some sort of historical document, or some book on some weird history. As for what it means, well, that depends on who you ask. And today we're going to be asking a Mr. Chip Berlet. Chip Berlet is, from what I could figure out so far, a relatively decent, admittedly left-leaning journalist who tries to cover some of the more loony aspects of the conspiratorial right-wing movements that honestly have plagued America since its founding and just never seem to want to go away. We're looking at an archive from 1999 of the PRA, or Political Research Associates. As it says here, this is an archive of older stuff. Some of the references might be a bit dated, and in fact even the article I'm reading is currently one of just a series of articles that is, well, about apocalyptic end times conspiracism stuff from 1999. And even though some of the stuff is outdated, I do find much of the other stuff to be still extremely relevant. So now, let's get into this, shall we? Conspiracist scapegoating and right-wing populism. An effective mechanism for inflaming conspiracist scapegoating throughout U.S. history has been apocalyptic forms of right-wing populism, especially when coupled with millennial expectation. This dynamic has been obscured because right-wing populism was branded by early academic studies as an extremist phenomenon among a lunatic fringe of the radical right, embracing a paranoid style and... Okay, yeah, if I were around, I probably would have asked him not to use passive tense. Passive tense bugs me a lot. This idea is a legacy from the first foray into establishing a broad social science outline for studying right-wing populism, the pluralist school of analysis, which saw right-wing social movements as outbursts of irrational collective behavior fueled by status anxiety. This view is called by its critics centrist extremist theory. Now it's time to challenge that centrist extremist theory. Centrist extremist theory arrived with the 1955 publication of a collection of essays titled The New American Right, edited by Daniel Bell. 8 years later, the collection was expanded and republished under the title The Radical Right. Contributors to this expanded volume included Bell, Alan F. Weston, Richard Hofstadter, and Richard Hofstadter, now that's, well, he's probably the most recognizable name, and I am a fan of his essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. I've recently read the short edition, and I've found out there's a longer edition. If I do have the time, I'd love to make a episode or 2 about the shorter and longer editions about the paranoid style in American politics. Great essay. I'll leave a link in the footnotes, or I guess that would be the bibliography, or maybe the description, depending on how I choose to format this. I'm still pretty new to this, but hey, I'll get the hang of it at some point. Seymour Martin Lipset, Earl Robb, Peter Viereck, Herbert H. Hyman, Talcott Parsons, David Reisman, and Nathan Glazer. Not all of the authors shared all of the analytical views outlined in the volume, but since 1955, a number of books appeared that either elaborated on or paralleled the general themes of centrist extremist theory first sketched out in the New American Right. Centrist extremist theory, especially as outlined by Lipset, Raab, Bierek, and Bell, sees dissident movements of the left and right as comprised of outsiders, politically marginal people who have no connection to the mainstream electoral system or nodes of government or corporate power. Social and economic stress snaps these psychologically fragile people into a mode of irrational political hysteria, and as they embrace an increasingly paranoid style, they make militant and unreasonable demands to defend their social and economic status. Because they are unstable, they can become dangerous and violent. Their extremism places them far outside the legitimate political process, which is located in the center where pluralists conduct civil democratic debates. The solution prescribed by the centrist extremist theory is to marginalize the dissidents and as radicals and dangerous religious political extremists. Their grievances and demands need not be taken seriously. Furthermore, law enforcement can then be relied on to break up any criminal conspiracies by subversive radicals who threaten the social order. Centrist extremist theory ignores real power struggles in the society. It is a status quo-oriented frame of reference that too often dismisses dissidents of all stripes. It stifles a healthy public debate over how to unravel systems of oppression, allows individuals to ignore their own complicity in oppressive behavior, and obscures these supremacist forces woven into our society's central institutions. An increasing number of progressive social scientists and analysts reject centrist extremist theory and use a different set of theories to explain how social movements work. As Christian Smith observes, let me think of a good voice to do Christian Smith. Let's see, a good voice for Christian Smith. Alright. The 1970s saw a major break in the social movement literature with earlier theories, such as mass society, collective behavior, status discontent, and relative deprivation theories, that emphasized the irrational and emotional nature of social movements. There was, at the time, a decisive pendulum swing away from these classical theories toward the view of social movements as rational, strategically calculating, politically instrumental phenomena. Using these new theories, a different paradigm emerges. According to this new paradigm, honestly, that word is always spelled so weird, like paradigm, alright. Most people who join right-wing populist movements are not acting out of some personal pathology, but out of anger and desperation. They are demonstrating a willingness to grasp at straws in an attempt to defend hearth and home against the furious winds of economic and social change threatening their way of life. They may feel abandoned or claim that no one in power seems to be listening. They come to believe that no one cares except others in the same predicament. Their anger and fear are frequently based on objective conditions and conflicts, power struggles invoking race, gender, ethnicity, or religion, economic hardship, changes in social status, conflicts over cultural issues, and other societal transformations that cause anger, confusion, and anxiety. Whether or not their grievances are legitimate, or even rational, they join with others to confront what they believe is the cause of their problems. Often, instead of challenging structures and institutions of power, they attack demonized scapegoats, often in the form of conspiracist allegations. Sometimes they resort to violence. If this characterization of right-wing populism is accurate, then activists developing strategies and tactics to challenge these movements need to rethink the ideas and rhetoric based on the centrist extremist model that favors labels such as radical right, wing nuts, lunatic fringe, or religious political extremists. Honestly, wingnut is just so much fun to say. Like, I don't know why, but wingnut just sounds so funny to me. I really hope we don't have to get rid of that one. Racism, sexism, homophobia, and anti-Semitism, along with other forms of supremacist ideology, are not the exclusive domain of marginal and militant groups, but are domiciled in mainstream U.S. culture and politics. Populist conspiracism. When conspiracism is blended with populism, the result is frequently a worldview called producerism. Here it is, the magic word I mentioned earlier. Producerist movements consider the real patriotic Americans to be hard-working people in the middle and working class who create goods and wealth while fighting against parasites at the top and bottom of society who pick their pockets. Gary Allen provides an example of producerism in his 1971 None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which included a graphic chart showing the middle class being squeezed between the ruling elite insiders above, pressured by the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Council on Foreign Relations, and the rabble below, pressured by naive radicals on the left, such as SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, the Yippies, the Young Socialist Alliance, and the Common Cause. And I want to say I actually found this diagram, and I mean... it's literally just a diagram of a clamp with some labels on it. I mean... I don't know why, but it's just so lazy. just a diagram of a clamp with labels. I mean, think about Gary Allen. Like, he was a writer for the John Birch Society, the people who I spent the intro of my previous video discussing, so I feel like he had to have at least something of a budget. At least my excuse is I'm doing this for fun and I have, like, no effing budget, so I'm barely using any graphics. But, like, come on! You gotta try at least a little better. In 1974, Allen updated the scenario in Rockefeller, Campaigning for the New World Order, articulating the anti-globalist theme of much more current conspiracism in the Patriot and armed militia movements. Allen's work is championed by the John Birch Society. I guess you could say championed by, he did literally work for them. I also believe he was an inspiration for Alex Jones. I mean, let's go back. You got the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Council on Foreign Relations. So those are people who Jones fetches about all the time. Now these guys are a bit outdated. Like, I mean, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, the Yippies, the Young Socialist Alliance, and the Common Cause. I don't think you ever see anything about them other than groups that might claim to be their successors, or people may be using them in some sort of 60s or 70s period piece. But honestly, this guy probably had a real influence on Alex Jones, considering his regular rantings about the Rothschilds, the Rothschilds, the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, all those dudes. Producerism not only promotes scapegoating, but also has a history of assuming that a proper citizen is a white male. And I'm going to say this is pretty true, and I'll actually go into more detail on it in the next video, which will have to discuss a lot of old-schooly racism. Historically, groups scapegoated by right-wing populist movements in the U.S. have been immigrants and people of color, especially blacks. Attention is diverted from inherent white supremacism by using coded language to reframe racism as a concern about specific issues such as welfare, immigration, tax, or education policies. Non-Christian religions, women, gay men and lesbians, youth, students, reproductive rights activists, and environmentalists are also scapegoated. You know, I'm sure if he rewrote this, he'd be sure to add trans folks. Holy heck, they're being scapegoated for, like, everything. Seriously, I mean, there's like, what? They're like half of 1% of the overall population, and yet, if you listen to the right-wing rage machine, you'd assume that they're hiding in every bathroom, trying to convert you to the transgender ideology. Aye. Sometimes producerism targets those persons who organize on behalf of impoverished and marginalized communities, especially progressive social change activists. The nativist and Americanist movements emerged as a way to promote a broad Christian nationalism and a way to enforce implicitly white supremacist Northern European cultural standards among increasingly diverse immigrant groups. Producerism played a key role in the shift from the early mode of right-wing populist conspiracism, which defended the status quo against a mob of outsiders, originally framed as a conspiracy of Freemasons, Jews, or aliens. And, well, yeah, I might have to do an episode on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or the PEZ for short. Now that's an infamous forgery. I think it's like the OG example of, the Jews are secretly trying to take over the world and here's the proof. And Honestly, that book just doesn't go away. But we'll discuss that more later. Today, right-wing populist conspiracism targets the government and other insiders, according to Michael Billing. With the replacement of the old aristocratic orders in Europe and the increasing participation of the middle classes in political life, there came a change in the themes of conspiracy mythology. In the United States, the change accompanied the threats to the hegemony of the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group posed by waves of new immigrants in the middle of the 19th century. The conspiracy theory ceased to defend government against the conspirators, but located the conspiracy within the government, or more often behind government. Two organizations representing the nativist tradition, the John Birch Society and the Liberty Lobby, played a significant role in promoting producerism and helped it transform into populist anti-government conspiracist themes during the 60s and 70s. This is going to be fun. The John Birch Society, or JBS for short, maintains that internationalist insiders with a collective agenda, claimed to be behind both communism and Wall Street capitalism, are engaged in a coordinated drive to destroy national sovereignty and individualism. Now, I just want to comment on the whole destroy individualism thing because it's never really about individualism, it's about social control. These types of folks, they'll go on and on about individualism, but the instant they see like a man wearing a dress, they're not going to be like, oh, he's expressing his individuality. They're going to be like, oh my god, what the hell are you doing? You're attacking Western civilization, you're a threat to everyone around you. God forbid you're an individual who doesn't conform to general societal standards. JBS members are primarily elitist, ultra-conservative, and reformist. Its conspiracist theories do not center on scapegoating Jews and Jewish institutions, nor do they center on biological racism. In a more subtle form of racism and anti-Semitism, and, well, honestly, if any of you remember my previous video, you can recall just how extremely elitist they were, and very racist as well. I mean, seriously, they were literally doing the whole white man's burden bullshit about like, oh yes, those colonists, they weren't rebelling because they had legitimate grievances. No, they were being manipulated by the communists. Those dark-skinned colonists should have just happily accepted their place beneath their benevolent white overlords. I finished, man. JBS promotes a culturally defined WASP ethnocentrism as the true expression of America. Echoing historic producerist themes, implicit racism and anti-Semitism are intrinsic to the group's ideology, but they are not articulated as principles of unity. JBS conspiracist narrative traces back to Robinson's book alleging an Illuminati Freemason conspiracy. Oh yeah, that's a classic. Like, honestly, the old school Illuminati fears, those are classics. The Society's roots are in business nationalism, economic libertarianism, anti-communism, Eurocentrism, and Christian fundamentalism. The Liberty Lobby's conspiracist narrative is that the secret elites are Jews, descended from non-European bloodlines, who manipulate black and other people of color to destroy national unity and popular will, which derives its strength from a racially separate organic tribalism. The lobby is primarily populist, fascist, and insurgent. It promotes conspiracist theories that center on scapegoating Jews and Jewish institutions, and on biological racism as the basis for white supremacist xenophobia. However, through the use of coded rhetoric and appeals to racial separatism that extol black nationalist groups, the group attempts, with some success, to mask its core racism and anti-Semitism. In fact, if I recall correctly, they're even they went out of business bit after this was published. They were also a Holocaust denial group. The Liberty Lobby relies on historic anti-Semitic conspiracist sources that trace back to the protocols, it's the Pez, and its many progeny. Its roots are in isolationism, small business resentment of large corporate interest, and eugenicist white racial nationalism. And the whole small business resentment of large corporate interest thing, that is something that really does come up a lot in producerism. It's this, general theme that we are the commoners, and anyone who disagrees with us is either an elite or a puppet of the elite, or a stooge of the elite, or maybe even a sellout to the elite. And it creates this thing where you have, for lack of a better word, you have many workers involved, and you also have the local elites, who maybe they are local, but they don't feel like they're elites. And that can result in this rather interesting but kind of hard to parse out alliance of groups who you would think shouldn't be getting along, but they are. But, I believe there's more on that later. The John Birch Society and Liberty Lobby both use populist rhetoric, but JBS members distrust the idea of the sovereignty of the people and stress that the U.S. is a republic, not a democracy, which they dismiss as a mobocracy. Now, I'll be honest, they're technically right, we are a republic, but we are a democratic republic, and a republic does not have to be democratic. Keep in mind that up until this was amended in the Constitution, senators were not elected by the people, but appointed by the states. I'll have to double check the amendment. I think it was shortly before Prohibition, so I believe, and it was also this would have been the 17th Amendment, I believe, shortly before giving women the right to vote. So yes, 17th Amendment said that now senators are not appointed but elected. Hopefully I don't get this wrong and I won't have to edit it later. So while I was off camera, I decided to check, and it turns out it was the 17th Amendment. Woohoo, I got something right. And again, this is Fact 5 so include that as one of your daily dose of facts. Now, this explains how the John Birch Society can criticize the alleged secret elites, yet retain an elitist point of view. They want to replace the bad elites with the good elites, presumably their allies. Okay, yep, now that's part of the line that I really wanted to comment on because, well, honestly, that is one big theme of right-wing populism that always bugs me. They love to act like, oh, we're against the elites, we're for the commoners, but if you break it down, they just don't like the certain elites in power and want their own elites who will promote whatever type of social order they want. My personal favorite example is how there's a decent amount of right-wing anti-communist populist types who will be like, yeah, we're pro-capitalism. Then the instant a CEO goes woke, they're like, no, daddy government, protect me from the invisible hand of the free market. Yeah, they're the only ones who ever deserve protection, I finished. Yeah. Both groups use conspiracist scapegoating, a common feature of right-wing populism. Starting in the 1970s, other branches of right-wing populist conspiracism began to grow. In the Christian right, the Christian Identity Religion, the Lyndon LaRouche Network, and in both secular and religious forms of survivalism. Populism can come from the bottom up, but it can also be deployed from the top down, used to attack the status quo by outsider business factions seeking to displace entrenched power structures. These outsider factions use populist rhetoric and conspiracist anti-elite scapegoating to attract constituencies in the middle class and working class. And I mean, it's not wrong. Like, it's one of those classic type of corporate ad campaigns where, like, hey, go against the norm, buy our corporate product instead of our competitor's corporate product. You buy ours, you're edgy and cool. You buy theirs, you're a Joe Schmo who nobody cares about. Only in this case, it's much more sinister. It's basically saying, hey, we're big business X, and we're tired of big business Y, who's been established for a long time, and, maybe big business Y was established for a long time, but they're like, yeah, we're for the people, we at big business X, even though they probably aren't going to use big business X or whatever their real business name was. They might say that, oh yeah, we're for the workers, we're job creators, we're providing for the people, when in actuality, anyone who digs deep enough can tell, like, they're just using the rhetoric of populism to try to gain more market share. Oh, as well as, pass laws that are beneficial to their business. As right-wing populist movements grow, they can lure mainstream politicians to adopt scapegoating in order to attract voters. Their theories can legitimize acts of discrimination or even violence, and reformist populist movements can open the door for insurgent right-wing movements such as fascism to recruit from their own movements by arguing that more drastic action is needed. Fascism itself is a distinctive form of conspiracist right-wing populism. And before anyone in the comments is like, no, the fascists were left-wing or something stupid like that, or even saying, you're saying right-wing populists are fascists? The answer is no. Fascism is, however, a form of right-wing quasi-populism. I personally am a fan of Umberto Eco's description of it in Fascism, my literal favorite essay of all time, and I hope to do a video on that in the future. But until then, we will continue. Because, well, if I just went into all the cool stuff and all the way things are described in Eurofascism, we'd be here forever. Fascist groups are not likely to seize state power in the US or in most countries, but can seriously damage attempts to extend democracy and equality as they encourage scapegoating and conspiracism in adaptive and creative ways while engaging in recruitment and ideological training. I'll be completely honest. I can really vibe with that. I mean, take, for example, even modern-day Trumpism. Like, they'll complain about, immigrants taking our jobs, but at the same time, almost all that anger is focused on the immigrants themselves, not even the businesses who are hypothetically stealing jobs from Americans by giving them to immigrants. You can even see it in the general policy. It's like, what's that? You're an undocumented immigrant? The heel of the state shall crush you beneath. You shall suffer immensely for your crime of being in the wrong place without proper paperwork. And then, they look at the businesses, they're like, aw, you little rascal, here's a fine, don't do it again. I finished me. Because right-wing conspiracism so often rests on anti-elite critique, it has been known to fool gullible leftists. Okay, yep, that is very true. That is very, very true. I mean, let's be honest, everyone has at least one story of these weird lefty folks who are like, yeah, I'm anti-establishment, and I'm tired of the milquetoast left, so I'm going to join the populist right because they are really anti-establishment. Hint, they are not really anti-establishment, they're just mad that the establishment is not specifically catering to them. Various Green Party activists have had to struggle against conspiracism, including the anti-Semitic variant, among members and even a handful of leaders. Populist conspiracism also has found a home in certain black nationalist and Arab anti-imperialist groups. Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi has actually tried to unite the left and right groups that oppose the U.S. government at meetings in Tripoli, Libya. We must be careful to draw a distinction between critiques that extend economic and social justice and those who claim that economic privilege for middle-class consumers at the expense of social justice. And, yeah, honestly, that is very, very true. In fact, I just remember now my personal favorite example is when these so-called anti-establishment folks deal with the police. They're like, on the one hand, they're like, what is it? It's like, man, you can't trust the state, you gotta be skeptical of it, smell government for the win. And then the instant the police come, they're like, no, you can't criticize the state, you can't go against the state. And then they'll see people defund the police, they're like, what, cut taxes? Spend less money on the state? Are you mad? You must comply with the state. I mean, yeah, the state massacred someone in cold blood, but he didn't comply. Comply or die. I finished mere these sheer mental gymnastics these folks will literally be like, yeah, I'm against the state, but also don't you dare go against the police in any way, shape, or form. They're like, I think they're just unable to accept that the police are not only part of the state, but the literal arm of the state, the law enforcers. It honestly makes me laugh whenever I see a car that has, don't tread on me on one side, and then, I think Mullen Labe, come and take them, try to take my guns, and the other side, Blue Lives Matter. I mean, you know what? I get it, policing is a difficult job. But at the same time, you're saying, don't take my guns. Well, who do you think's going to take your guns? It ain't going to be me. And I don't think it's going to be those obnoxious, blue-haired, SJWs, I think. It's not going to be them. Anti-regime criticism is rampant in the conspiracist right. There is a need to educate and thus inoculate large sectors of the white middle class and working class against the dead end of right-wing populism with its penchant for scapegoating. If we tolerate the paradigm of conspiracist scapegoating by right-wing economic populists, simply because it appears to advance a short-term anti-corporate or anti-government agenda, we are creating a dangerous alliance with people whose long-term vision, wittingly or unwillingly, promotes racist, sexist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic outcomes. We will be throwing our long-term allies overboard and helping sink the ship of state, when we should be plotting a new course on a sturdy vessel we all help to rebuild. This is especially true given the current period of apocalyptic anxiety and millennial energy, which infuses the Christian right, populist right, and far right. Well, thank you for listening to the article, and those are my commentaries on Facts 5 And honestly, I hope that this can give us all something to really think about. And once I record episode 2, part 2, it's going to go into a bit more of a historical description of producerism. And honestly, well, this word producerism, I think that it really does help put to words something that and I wouldn't be surprised if any of my listeners, or would you be watchers, I guess, and could be either, or audience, that's a better word, audience, have observed but haven't been able to put a word to. It's mostly this general dislike for what they'll call elites, but also a dislike for people on the bottom who they perceive as parasites. It's this idea that they want the state to leave them alone, but also have no issue with the state using its heel to crush dissidents, to crush protesters, to basically do almost whatever it wants with impunity as long as it's not on me. Well, Not me personally, but you know what I mean. But me as in the hypothetical producerist. It's this idea of they're mad at the elites. They'll claim to be anti-elitist, but then when you actually break it down, it's more they're mad that the elites are not using their authority on whom the producerists perceive as the right people. They're using them on me, the hypothetical producer, and not on Joe Schmo, who is maybe a hypothetical welfare moocher, or even, if I want to get a bit more charitable, maybe, some rich aristocrat who hoards all his money and has never worked a day in his life. Well, comment on what you think. Feel free to subscribe, share this around if you want. And remember, this is Facts 5 each episode containing 1/5 of your recommended daily dose of facts. Have a wonderful day.